They said her eyes could pierce a man's soul. They said her voice could change the wind. They said she was worth more than any human being had a right to be. But what they never said was the truth. Charleston, 1851. The woman who would become the most expensive purchase in the history of the American slave trade was about to step onto that auction block, and nothing in the South would ever be the same. The morning broke cold over Charleston, South Carolina, though it was mid-August and the heat should have been oppressive. The slaves huddled in their holding pens at Ryan's Mart on Chalmers Street had learned not to question the strangeness that had settled over the city in recent weeks. The Ashley River had turned peculiar shades at twilight. Birds flew in patterns that made no sense. And whispers traveled through the slave quarters about a woman who had arrived 3 days prior, a woman who refused to speak her name. Thomas Calloway had been an auctioneer for 17 years, and he prided himself on maintaining composure regardless of what merchandise stood before him. He had sold children away from their mothers without flinching. He had separated husbands from wives with the efficiency of a butcher sectioning meat. But when he opened the door to holding cell number 7 that morning, his hand trembled on the iron latch. She sat in the corner, her back perfectly straight despite 3 days without proper rest. Her skin held an unusual bronze tone, neither the deep black of the coastal Africans nor the lighter shade of those born in the Caribbean, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were pale, almost translucent grey, like looking through fog at something burning beneath. "Lot number 93, Calloway said, his voice catching. "Time to go. What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you." She rose without a word, moving with a grace that seemed impossible given the heavy iron shackles around her ankles. As she passed him in the doorway, Calloway caught a scent like rain on hot stones, like something ancient and wild. He stumbled backward, and she paused. "You fear what you cannot name," she said softly, her accent strange and unplaceable. "But fear will not save you from what comes." Outside, the auction block had been erected in the courtyard, a raised wooden platform that had seen thousands of souls pass across its surface. The buyers had already begun to gather, wealthy plantation owners from across the Carolinas, Georgia, even as far as Louisiana and Mississippi. Word had spread that something unusual was being offered today, and the curious and the cruel had come in equal measure. James Rutledge stood among them, owner of Marble Gate Plantation, a 3,000-acre cotton empire that stretched along the Ashley River 15 miles north of the city. He was a practical man, not given to superstition or fancy. He had come to Charleston to purchase 2 field hands and perhaps a house servant if the price was reasonable. He had not expected the crowd. "What's all this about?" he asked Samuel Preston, a neighboring planter who stood fidgeting with his pocket watch. Preston's face had gone pale. "They say she came off a ship from nowhere, no manifest, no papers. The captain claimed she appeared in the hold 3 days out of port, standing among the cargo as if she'd always been there." "Nonsense," Rutledge muttered. "Someone's invented a mystery to drive up the price." "Perhaps," Preston replied. "But I've heard other things. They say she speaks languages no scholar can identify. They say she knew the names of men who questioned her, though she'd never met them. They say—" The murmur of the crowd died suddenly. Thomas Calloway had emerged from the holding building, and behind him came the woman. The chains clinked softly as she walked, the only sound in a courtyard that had fallen silent as a grave. She stepped onto the auction block without assistance, turning slowly to face the assembled crowd. The morning sun caught her face, and James Rutledge felt something shift in his chest, a sensation like the ground falling away beneath his feet. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty that inspired unease rather than desire. Her features were refined, aristocratic even, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that suggested noble lineage. But those eyes, Those strange, pale eyes seemed to look through each man present and find them wanting. Calloway cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, I present lot number 93. Female, approximately 25 years of age, healthy, no visible defects." His prepared speech faltered. "She gives her name as Sailor." "Where's she from?" someone called from the crowd. Calloway hesitated. "Origin unknown, but I assure you the sale is legal and proper." "What can she do?" another voice demanded. "Field work? House service?" Before Calloway could answer, the woman spoke. "I was not born to serve," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the courtyard with unnatural clarity. "I was promised to no man, yet here I stand in chains. Ask yourself why." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Slaves did not speak at auction. They did not address potential buyers with such directness, such absence of deference. "Quiet," Calloway hissed at her, but she did not acknowledge him. James Rutledge found himself stepping forward, drawn by something he could not name. "If you were promised to no man," he said slowly, "then to what were you promised?" She turned those pale eyes on him, and he felt the world narrow to just the two of them, the crowd fading to shadows. "To the freedom that was stolen from my people," she replied. "To the reckoning that comes for all men who build their wealth on suffering." "Enough!" Calloway snapped, panic rising in his voice. "Gentlemen, shall we begin the bidding? Do I hear $1,000? 2,000, Preston called out immediately, eager to move past the woman's strange pronouncements. 3,000, came another voice. James Rutledge stood frozen, his mind racing. Everything about this was wrong. The woman's bearing, her speech, the way she seemed to radiate something that made his skin prickle with awareness. He should walk away. He should leave this cursed auction and return to his plantation empty-handed. $5,000, he heard himself say. The crowd turned to stare at him. $5,000 was an astronomical sum for a single slave, more than many men paid for a house and land combined. "Mr. Rutledge," Calloway said, relief flooding his features. 5,000, do I hear 6? 7,000, came a voice from the back of the crowd. Augustus Whitmore, a planter from Louisiana known for his cruelty and his vast wealth, pushed his way forward. "I'll pay 7,000 for this one." The bidding had taken on a life of its own now, driven by pride and competition as much as by any practical consideration. The numbers climbed, 8,000, 10,000, amounts that made even the wealthiest men present shake their heads in disbelief. All the while, Sella stood motionless on the auction block, her expression unreadable. She did not look afraid. She did not look resigned. If anything, there was something like pity in her strange, pale eyes as she watched the men fight over the right to own her. $15,000, Rutledge called out, his voice hoarse. He did not know what drove him, what madness had seized his mind, but he knew with terrible certainty that he could not let this woman fall into Augustus Whitmore's hands. Silence fell. Whitmore glared at Rutledge, his jaw clenched. For a long moment it seemed he might bid higher still. Then he spat on the ground and turned away. "She's cursed," he muttered. "Mark my words, Rutledge. You'll regret this purchase." The gavel fell. "Sold to Mr. James Rutledge of Marblegate Plantation for $15,000. As the crowd dispersed, muttering about the extraordinary sum, Rutledge approached the auction block where Sella still stood. Up close, he could see that her skin held a faint luminescence, as if lit from within by some inner fire. "I don't know what you are," he said quietly, "but I will treat you fairly. You have my word." She looked down at him from the platform, and for the first time, something like emotion crossed her face. Sadness, perhaps, or was it recognition? "Words mean nothing," she replied softly. "Only actions echo into eternity. You have purchased something you do not understand, Mr. Rutledge. And before this season ends, you will know the price of such ignorance." The iron shackles fell away from her ankles with a sound like breaking glass. Calloway cried out in alarm, but when he looked, the locks remained intact. It should have been impossible. Selah stepped down from the platform and walked toward the wagon that would carry her to Marble Gate Plantation. As she passed, each man in the courtyard felt a sudden chill despite the August heat, as if winter had breathed across their graves. James Rutledge signed the papers with shaking hands, committing $15,000, nearly a quarter of his total wealth, to the purchase of a single woman whose very existence defied explanation. As his carriage rolled away from Ryan's Mart, he looked back to see Thomas Calloway standing alone in the empty courtyard, his face ashen, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. The journey to Marble Gate Plantation took 4 hours along roads lined with oak trees, draped in Spanish moss. Selah sat across from Rutledge in the carriage, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window. She had not spoken since leaving Charleston. "My wife is ill," Rutledge found himself saying, breaking the silence. "She's been declining for months. The doctors can find no cause." He did not know why he was telling her this. "I have a son, Thomas, age 7, and 53 slaves who work my fields." 54 now, Selah said without looking at him. "Yes, 54. He paused. "What are you?" Finally she turned those pale eyes on him. "I am what your kind tried to destroy but could not. I am memory. I am debt. I am the price that comes due for all debts, no matter how long delayed." The carriage wheels hit a rut, jolting them both. When Rutledge looked again, Selah had returned her gaze to the window, and he wondered if he had imagined the faint blue light that had flickered in her eyes. They arrived at Marble Gate as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The plantation house stood 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming in the golden light, a monument to wealth built on the backs of enslaved people. As the carriage came to a stop, slaves emerged from the fields and the quarters, gathering to see the newcomer. Rutledge's overseer, Harold Brennan, approached with his usual scowl. He was a hard man, efficient and without mercy, exactly the kind of overseer that kept a plantation profitable. "This is the one you paid $15,000 for?" he said, looking Selah up and down with undisguised skepticism. "Mind your tone, Brennan," Rutledge warned. Selah stepped down from the carriage, her bare feet touching the ground of Marble Gate for the first time, and in that moment every slave in the yard felt it, a tremor that ran through the earth like a heartbeat, like recognition, like the first stirring of something that had been sleeping far too long. An old woman named Patience, who had been born in Africa 60 years earlier and remembered freedom, fell to her knees. "Oshun," she whispered. "Oya, Yemoja." The names of goddesses, of powers that had crossed the ocean in the hearts of the stolen, powers that had waited for this moment. "Get up, old woman," Brennan snarled, raising his hand. "Touch her, and you will not see tomorrow," Selah said quietly. Brennan froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. He tried to move, tried to bring his arm down, but his body would not obey. Terror flooded his face as he realized he was paralyzed, held in place by nothing visible, nothing explicable. "Release him," Rutledge said, his voice tight. Selah glanced at the overseer, and Brennan stumbled backward, gasping. "What witchcraft is this?" he demanded. "There is no witchcraft," Selah replied, "only a reckoning that has been too long delayed." The first night at Marble Gate Plantation, no one slept. The slaves lay in their quarters, whispering prayers in languages half-remembered, calling on powers their grandparents had brought from across the ocean. In the main house, James Rutledge sat by his wife's bedside, watching her labored breathing and wondering what he had brought into his home. And Selah stood in the doorway of the small cabin they had assigned her, barefoot on the wooden porch, her pale eyes fixed on the cotton fields that stretched away into darkness. She did not move. She did not seem to breathe. She simply stood, as if waiting for something only she could sense approaching. In Charleston, Thomas Calloway woke screaming from dreams of drowning, of water filling his lungs, while pale eyes watched him sink. In Louisiana, Augustus Whitmore discovered that every slave on his plantation had vanished in the night, leaving only the echo of singing he could not quite hear, but knew would haunt him until his death. The moon rose full and bright over Marble Gate, and by its light the slaves who dared to look saw Sella raise her hands toward the sky, and from her fingertips blue fire danced. Margaret Rutledge had been a beauty once, before the fever that would not break, and the wasting that followed. Now she lay propped against pillows in the master bedroom, her skin translucent, her breathing shallow. The doctors had bled her, dosed her with mercury and laudanum, and finally admitted they did not understand her affliction. James had spent 3 months watching his wife fade, powerless to stop it. He had prayed. He had raged. He had thrown money at every charlatan and healer who promised a cure. Nothing helped. When dawn broke over Marble Gate on Sailor's second day, Rutledge found his wife sitting up in bed for the first time in weeks, her eyes clear and focused on the window. "There is someone in the garden," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "A woman. I've been watching her for hours." Rutledge moved to the window and looked down at the formal garden his wife had once tended with such care. Sailor stood among the roses, her hands moving in patterns he could not decipher, her lips forming words he could not hear. As he watched, the roses, which had withered and died as Margaret sickened, began to bloom. Tight buds unfurled into full flowers, their colours vibrant and impossible. "What is she doing?" Margaret whispered. "I don't know," Rutledge admitted. "I don't know what she is." By noon, Margaret was standing. By evening she was walking through the house with steady steps, her colour returned, her strength renewed. The household staff whispered among themselves, calling it a miracle. But they avoided looking at Sella, who had returned to her cabin and not emerged since the morning. Harold Brennan, the overseer, was not a man given to fear. He had broken rebellious slaves without hesitation, had separated families without remorse, had built his reputation on the ruthless efficiency with which he extracted labor from human property. But since the moment Sella had frozen him in place with nothing but her words, something had changed. He found himself unable to raise his whip. His hand would lift, would draw back to strike, and then would simply stop as if encountering an invisible wall. The slaves noticed. Within 2 days, productivity in the fields had not decreased, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was less terror, less submission. The songs they sang as they worked changed, becoming older, carrying rhythms that made Brennan's skin crawl. On the 3rd night, he went to Sela's cabin with a knife in his belt and murder in his heart. He would end this strangeness, this witchcraft that was undermining his authority. He would kill her and bury the body where no one would find it. He found her sitting on the porch steps, as if she had been waiting for him. "You cannot do what you came to do," she said, without turning to look at him. "Your hand will not obey your will. Your body knows what your mind refuses to accept." Brennan tried to draw the knife. His fingers would not close around the handle. He tried to step forward. His feet would not move. "What have you done to me?" he gasped. "Nothing," Sella replied, finally turning those pale eyes on him. "I have simply removed your ability to inflict suffering. The violence in your heart remains, but your body will no longer serve it. Consider it a gift." "You're a demon," Brennan whispered. "No," Sella said softly. "I am something far older than your demons. I am the accumulated weight of every prayer spoken by those you have tormented. I am the answer that was always coming, though it took centuries to arrive." Brennan fled into the night, and by morning he was gone. His few possessions remained in his quarters by the barn, but the man himself had vanished, as if he had never existed. Some said they heard him screaming in the woods beyond the plantation boundaries. Others claimed they saw him walking into the Ashley River at dawn, his eyes blank, his lips moving in silent conversation with something only he could see. James Rutledge did not mourn Brennan's disappearance. He had more pressing concerns. The cotton plants in the eastern fields, which should have been thriving in the late summer heat, had turned black overnight. Not the black of disease or drought, but a deep, absolute black, as if they had been burned by invisible fire. Yet when he touched them, they were cool and left a residue like charcoal on his fingers. "Sailor," he said when he found her at the edge of the blighted field. "Did you do this?" She stood with her back to him, her hands at her sides, her head tilted as if listening to something he could not hear. "I did nothing," she said. "The land itself is responding. You have taken from it for generations without asking permission, without offering thanks. Now it remembers how to refuse." "This will ruin me," Rutledge said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Those fields represent thousands of dollars. Without the cotton, you will be merely wealthy instead of obscenely so." Seller interrupted, turning to face him. "Tell me, Mr. Rutledge, which concerns you more, the loss of money or the fact that you are beginning to understand what you have participated in all these years?" He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he was not like the cruel masters, that he fed his slaves well and rarely used the whip. But the words died in his throat because he saw the truth in her eyes. All the rationalizations, all the justifications, all the careful distinctions he had drawn between himself and the truly monstrous men who owned human beings meant nothing. He was complicit. He had always been complicit. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want nothing from you," Seller replied. "But the universe wants balance, and balance will be restored, whether you will it or not." That night, Margaret came to him in his study where he sat staring at ledgers that no longer made sense. "She healed me," his wife said without preamble. "Whatever that woman is, whatever she's done, she gave me back my life." "At what cost?" Rutledge asked. Margaret was silent for a long moment. "Perhaps at the cost of our souls," she said finally. "Perhaps that is exactly the price we deserve to pay." In the slave quarters, something was changing. The people who had been beaten down, who had learned to survive by making themselves small and invisible, were beginning to remember who they had been before the chains. Old Patience gathered the others in the darkness and told them stories her grandmother had told her, stories of gods who walked the earth and righted wrongs, stories of justice that came slowly but with terrible finality. "She is Oya," Patience said, her voice trembling with something between fear and exultation. "Goddess of the wind and the storm, goddess of transformation and rebirth. She has come to break our chains, but not in the way you think. She will not lead us to freedom. She will remake the world until freedom is the only possibility that remains." The younger slaves listened with wide eyes. They had been born in bondage, had never known another existence. The idea that the world could be remade seemed impossible, yet they had seen the roses bloom at Selah's command. They had seen the overseer vanish. They had felt the shift in the very air they breathed. Selah herself did not sleep. Each night she walked the boundaries of Marble Gate Plantation, her bare feet leaving prints that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. She whispered to the earth, to the trees, to the river that flowed past the property. And the land listened. The land remembered what it had been before men came with their instruments of bondage and their belief that everything could be owned. On the 7th night, the Ashley River began to glow. It started as a faint luminescence, barely visible in the moonlight. But by midnight, the water shone with an inner light, pale blue and eerily beautiful. Those who lived along its banks came to their windows and stared in wonder and terror. Those who dared to approach the water's edge and cup it in their hands found it warm, almost body temperature, and tasting of salt, though the river was fresh water. Men with scientific instruments came to take measurements and collect samples. They found nothing unusual in their tests, no explanation for the phenomenon. But those who drank from the river, who let the glowing water pass their lips, fell into deep sleeps and dreamed of a bronze-skinned woman with pale eyes who asked them a single question: "What price are you willing to pay for what you have stolen?" The dreams spread. Within 2 weeks, half of Charleston was waking in cold sweats, haunted by visions of accounts coming due. of debts that had been ignored for generations but could no longer be denied. Slave owners began to fall ill with mysterious ailments that no doctor could diagnose or treat. Their wives saw shadows in mirrors that did not match their reflections. Their children heard voices calling their names in empty rooms. And through it all, Selah walked the fields of Marblegate, untouched and unmoved, waiting for the transformation she had set in motion to run its course. James Rutledge made a decision. He called together the 54 people he owned and told them they were free. He had the papers drawn up, legal documents of manumission that would allow them to leave Marblegate and start new lives. He expected gratitude. He expected relief. Instead, old Patience laughed. "You think freedom is yours to give?" she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "You think a piece of paper changes what has been done? Freedom is not yours to grant, Master. It never was." "Then what do you want?" Rutledge demanded, frustration and confusion warring in his voice. Patience looked past him to where Selah stood in the doorway of the main house, a silent observer. "We want what cannot be given," the old woman said. "We want the years returned. We want the dead restored. We want justice that reaches back through time and forward into eternity. Can you give us that with your papers?" Rutledge had no answer. He let his hand fall, the documents fluttering to the ground like broken promises. That night, Margaret found him in the garden among the roses that should not be blooming. "What have we done?" she whispered. "We have lived as people live," he replied, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We have done what was legal, what was accepted." "That is not the same as right," Margaret said. She knelt and picked up one of the roses, its petals impossibly red in the moonlight. "She did not heal me out of kindness. She healed me so I could bear witness to what comes next." As if summoned by her words, Selah appeared at the edge of the garden. "You begin to understand," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. "The healing was not mercy. It was necessity. You must both be strong for what approaches." "What is approaching?" Rutledge asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Reckoning," Selah replied. "The kind that has been delayed for centuries, but can no longer be postponed. This plantation, this city, this entire nation has been built on theft and suffering. The debt has grown too large. Payment is now demanded." By the 4th week of Selah's presence at Marblegate, the phenomenon had spread beyond the plantation, beyond Charleston, rippling outward like circles from a stone thrown into still water. Slave owners throughout South Carolina reported strange occurrences: chains that rusted through overnight, locks that opened themselves, crops that withered in fields despite abundant rain, livestock that died without visible cause. The whispers began in earnest. Some called it divine judgment. Others blamed witchcraft, demanded investigations, wanted someone burned or hanged, but no one could point to a specific act of rebellion or sabotage. The events seemed to have no human cause, no logical explanation. In Charleston, the city council convened an emergency session. They reviewed the records of Selah's auction, seeking some legal means to void the sale, to remove her from the state. What they found instead made them close the records and order them sealed. The documents showed impossible things: signatures that changed when looked at directly, purchase amounts that varied depending on who read the ledger, descriptions of the woman that contradicted each other from line to line. Thomas Calloway, the auctioneer, was brought before the council to testify. He sat trembling in his chair, his face haggard, his hands shaking. "I don't know what I sold that day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was a woman, a slave. But the moment the gavel fell, I knew I had participated in something terrible, something that would change everything." "Be specific," Councilman Harrison demanded. "What exactly did you see or experience that leads you to these conclusions?" Calloway's eyes were haunted. "I have not slept properly since that day. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, all of them. every man, woman, and child I have sold over 17 years. They stand before me, not accusing, just watching, waiting. And she stands among them, that woman with the pale eyes, and she says the same thing every time. The books are being balanced, the debts are coming due. The council dismissed him, but his testimony spread through Charleston like wildfire. Men who had built fortunes on the auction block began to report similar dreams, similar visions. The nightmares were spreading, jumping from person to person like a plague, but a plague of conscience rather than disease. At Marble Gate, the transformation continued. The 54 people whom Rutledge had freed, but who had chosen to remain on the plantation, were changing. Not physically, but in ways more profound. They stood straighter, spoke more freely, moved with a confidence that years of bondage should have beaten out of them. Young Thomas Rutledge, age 7, became fascinated with Selah. He would sit on the porch of her cabin for hours, listening as she told him stories. Not children's tales, but histories. She spoke of kingdoms in Africa that had existed for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. She described mathematical and astronomical knowledge that rivaled or exceeded anything developed in the West. She painted pictures with her words of cultures rich and complex, of peoples who had been deliberately erased from the history books so that their enslavement could be justified. Margaret Rutledge watched her son with growing unease. "Should we stop him from spending so much time with her?" she asked her husband. James looked at his son, saw the wonder and curiosity in the boy's eyes, and shook his head. "Perhaps it is good that he learns the truth," he said slowly. "Perhaps if his generation understands what ours has done, they can choose differently." But Margaret was not convinced. "Or perhaps she is poisoning his mind against us, against his own family." That evening, Margaret confronted Selah directly. She found the woman by the river, standing at the water's edge, where the glow was strongest. "What are you teaching my son?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp with a mother's protective fear. Selah did not turn. "I am teaching him what you should have taught him from birth," she replied, "that every human being has value, that skin color does not determine worth. That the system his family participates in is built on a lie so profound that entire nations have organized themselves around maintaining it." "He is 7 years old," Margaret protested. "He is too young for such heavy truths." "He is old enough to benefit from the labor of those you keep enslaved," Selah said, finally turning to face her. "He is old enough to eat food prepared by hands that are not free. He is old enough to sleep in a house built by people who had no choice. If he is old enough to benefit, he is old enough to understand the cost." Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes. "You healed me. Why? If you hate us so much, why did you save my life?" For the first time since her arrival, something like gentleness crossed Selah's face. "I do not hate you," she said quietly. "I pity you. You have been taught a lie your entire life and built your identity upon it. Now that lie is crumbling, and you must choose what you will build in its place. I healed you because you will need your strength for what comes, and because your son needs at least one parent who has the courage to change." The confrontation left Margaret shaken. She returned to the house and spent the night in her study reading. For the first time in her life, she sought out texts written by those who opposed slavery, narratives written by those who had escaped it. What she read challenged everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about the natural order of the world. By dawn, Margaret's world view lay in ruins around her, and in its destruction, something new began to grow. Not understanding exactly, not yet, but the willingness to question, which was perhaps more important. The turning point came 6 weeks after Selah's arrival. Augustus Whitmore, the Louisiana planter who had bid against Rutledge at the auction, arrived at Marble Gate in the middle of the night with 10 armed men. He had lost everything in the week since that day, his slaves freed by methods he could not explain, his wealth evaporating as if it had never existed. Madness had taken root in his mind, feeding on rage and the need for someone to blame. "Bring her out!" he screamed, standing in the front yard with a torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Bring out the witch, or I'll burn this entire plantation to the ground." James Rutledge emerged onto the front porch, his own rifle in hand. "Leave my property, Whitmore. You have no business here." "She has destroyed me," Whitmore snarled. "Everything I had, everything I built, gone because of her cursed presence in this world. I will kill her, and then perhaps the madness will stop." Before Rutledge could respond, Sella walked out of the darkness. She moved through the armed men as if they were not there, and though several raised their weapons, none could pull their triggers. She stopped 10 feet from Whitmore, her pale eyes reflecting the torchlight. "I have destroyed nothing," she said calmly. "I have simply removed the blinders that allowed you to ignore the suffering your wealth was built upon. What you call destruction is merely clarity. What you call madness is merely truth." Whitmore raised his pistol, his hand shaking with rage and terror. "Devil," he whispered. "No," Sella replied. "I am far older than your devil. I am the force that existed before your religions gave names to good and evil. I am balance. I am consequence. I am the future that was always coming." The pistol fired. The sound cracked across the plantation yard, echoing from the main house to the slave quarters to the river beyond. But Sella did not fall. She did not even flinch. The bullet hung in the air between them, suspended as if time itself had stopped. Every person present saw it clearly, the lead ball hovering motionless, caught in some impossible field that defied all natural law. Slowly, Sella reached out and plucked the bullet from the air. She held it up to the torchlight, examining it with mild interest. "This is what you put your faith in," she said. "Metal and violence. But there are forces in this world that such things cannot touch." She opened her hand, and the bullet fell to the ground, landing with a soft thud in the dirt. Augustus Whitmore's mind broke. He stood staring at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his eyes wide with horror that had transcended sanity. His men backed away slowly, then broke and ran, leaving their employer alone in the yard with his torch and his empty pistol. "Go home," Sella said gently, "or what remains of it. Live with what you have done, and if you have any humanity left, spend your remaining days trying to make amends for the suffering you have caused." Whitmore dropped the torch, dropped the pistol. He turned and walked away into the darkness, and those who saw him said he moved like a man already dead, just a body that had not yet realized it should fall. In the days following Whitmore's attack, the story spread. The woman who could not be killed. The woman who had stopped a bullet with nothing but her will. The woman who was systematically dismantling the institution of slavery not through rebellion or violence, but through something far more terrifying, by forcing those who participated in it to see clearly what they had become. More visitors came to Marble Gate. Some came out of curiosity. Some came seeking healing for ailments that physicians could not cure. Some came hoping to buy Sailor, to possess her power for themselves. All went away changed, whether they wanted to be or not. James Rutledge found himself torn between worlds. He had freed his slaves, but they remained on his land, working the fields not out of compulsion but by choice, sharing equally in the profits. The arrangement was unprecedented, scandalous, and surprisingly successful. Other planters whispered about him, called him a traitor to his race, to his class, to the Southern way of life. But his cotton, the small amount that still grew in the few fields that had not turned black, fetched premium prices. His household ran smoothly. His wife was healthier than she had been in years. And his son was growing up with an understanding of justice that might perhaps help him build a better world. "What happens now?" Rutledge asked Sella one evening as they stood together watching the sun set over the Ashley River. The water still glowed faintly, a reminder of forces at work beyond human understanding. Now the change spreads, Sella replied, like ripples from a stone thrown into water. It cannot be stopped. It can only be accepted or resisted. Those who accept will survive the transformation. Those who resist will be swept away by it. And what of you? Rutledge asked. What happens to you when this is finished? Salah turned those pale eyes on him, and for a moment he saw in them something vast and ancient, something that had existed long before humans walked the earth and would exist long after they were gone. I will return to where I came from, she said, back into the collective consciousness of all those who have suffered injustice, back into the dreams of those who hunger for freedom. I am not truly an individual, Mr. Rutledge. I am a manifestation of accumulated will, of prayers spoken over generations. When my purpose here is complete, I will dissolve back into that greater whole. The revelation should have comforted him, the idea that this disruption would end. Instead, it filled him with unexpected sadness. Then we will forget, he said. We will forget what you taught us and return to our old ways. Some will, Sailor agreed. But not all, and those who remember will teach others. Change is never complete in a single generation, but once begun, it cannot be entirely reversed. I am the beginning, not the end. What comes after will be determined by choices made by people like you, by your son, by all those who have seen clearly and must now decide what they will do with that sight. 3 months after her arrival at Marble Gate, Sella began to fade, not physically, but in some ineffable way. Her form seemed less solid, more translucent, as if she were becoming a memory, even while still present. Those who encountered her found it difficult to remember her face after she had gone, as if their minds could not quite hold on to the specifics of her features, but her influence only grew stronger. Across South Carolina, across the entire South, the strange phenomena continued and intensified. Plantations reported crop failures that defied agricultural explanation. Slave rebellions erupted with unprecedented coordination, as if some unseen force were organizing resistance across hundreds of miles. And the dreams, the terrible haunting dreams of accounts coming due, spread like an epidemic. In Charleston, a group of ministers came together to discuss what they called the spiritual crisis. Churches were packed with slave owners seeking absolution, demanding that their pastors explain how a just God could allow such afflictions. The pastors struggled to provide answers that did not undermine the theological justifications for slavery that had been preached from Southern pulpits for generations. Reverend John Whitfield, pastor of St. Michael's Episcopal Church on Meeting Street, was among the few who dared to suggest that what was happening might indeed be divine judgment. "We have built our prosperity on the backs of those made in God's image," he preached one Sunday morning in November. "We have ignored the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. We have twisted Scripture to justify the unjustifiable. Is it any wonder that we now face consequences?" The congregation erupted in outrage. By the following Sunday, Reverend Whitfield had been removed from his pulpit and run out of Charleston. But his sermon had been published in northern newspapers, and it sparked a firestorm of debate that could no longer be contained within the boundaries of academic discussion or polite disagreement. The country was moving toward a crisis, though most did not yet see it clearly. The tensions that would erupt into civil war within a decade were crystallizing, and at the center of the crystallization was the question that Sella embodied. Could a nation built on the enslavement of millions of people claim to be civilized? Could it call itself Christian? Could it speak of liberty while denying it to so many? At Marble Gate, life had taken on a strange new rhythm. The people who had been slaves now worked as paid laborers, an arrangement that baffled and scandalized the neighboring planters. They lived in better housing that Rutledge had constructed, ate better food, received medical care when needed. Their children were learning to read and write, taught by Margaret Rutledge, who had taken on the role of teacher with surprising passion. Young Thomas spent his days divided between his formal schooling and his time with Selah. She taught him not just history, but philosophy, mathematics, astronomy. She showed him how to look at the stars and see patterns, how to understand that the universe was far larger and more complex than the small world of Charleston and its peculiar institution. "Why do people enslave each other?" Thomas asked her one afternoon as they sat by the river. He was 8 now, old enough to ask difficult questions and young enough to still expect truthful answers. Selah considered the question carefully. "Because they have convinced themselves that some people are less than human," she said finally. "Because greed is powerful and conscience is weak. Because it is easier to profit from suffering than to acknowledge that profit as theft." "But you're changing that," Thomas said with the confidence of a child who had seen miracles. "You're making it so slavery can't continue." "I am revealing what was always true," Selah corrected gently. "The evil of slavery existed whether people acknowledged it or not. I have simply removed the ability to ignore it, to rationalize it, to build pretty lies around it. What your people do with that clarity is not my choice. It is yours." "I would free everyone," Thomas declared. "If I had the power, I would free every slave in America." Selah looked at him with those pale eyes that seemed to see into his soul. "Freedom given is not the same as freedom taken," she said. "True liberation comes not from the master's benevolence, but from the slave's recognition of their own inherent right to liberty. I do not free people, young Thomas. I help them remember that they were never rightfully enslaved to begin with." That winter was the coldest anyone could remember in Charleston's recorded history. Snow fell where it rarely did, accumulating in drifts against the grand houses on the Battery, blanketing the slave markets in white that somehow made them look even more obscene. The Ashley River froze partially, something locals swore had never happened before, and the ice glowed blue at night, beautiful and terrible. James Rutledge's experiment in free labor proved successful beyond anyone's expectations. His cotton, though grown in far smaller quantities than before, was of exceptional quality. Word spread of his methods, and a few brave planters began to consider whether the traditional system might indeed be immoral as well as potentially unprofitable if the strange phenomena continued. But most did not change. Most doubled down, increased their violence, tightened their control over those they enslaved. They armed themselves and their overseers, formed vigilance committees, and spoke openly of the need to suppress by force any movement toward emancipation. The resistance to change was fierce and organized. In February, a group of planters from the surrounding region came to Marble Gate, 20 men on horseback, armed and determined. They had come to demand that Rutledge return to traditional plantation management and that he surrender Selah to them for trial on charges of witchcraft and inciting rebellion. Rutledge met them in his front yard, refusing to invite them into his home. "Gentlemen, you have no authority here," he said calmly. "Selah is a free woman. She has broken no laws. She has harmed no one." "She has cursed us," Nathaniel Bradley, the spokesman for the group, snarled. "Since she came to Charleston, nothing has been right. The natural order has been disrupted. She must be removed." "The natural order," Rutledge repeated slowly. "Tell me, Mr. Bradley, what is natural about men owning other men? What is natural about tearing children from their mothers' arms to sell them like cattle? What is natural about building an entire economy on stolen labor and stolen lives?" The words shocked everyone present, including Rutledge himself. He had not planned to speak so plainly, to voice thoughts he had barely admitted to himself, but once begun, he could not stop. "We have called it natural because it profited us," he continued. "We have called it ordained by God because that allowed us to sleep at night. But it is neither natural nor divine. It is simply evil, and Selah has not cursed us. She has simply forced us to see clearly what we are." The silence that followed was profound. Several of the planters looked shaken, as if Rutledge had voiced doubts they themselves had harbored, but never dared speak aloud. But Bradley's face had gone red with rage. "You have betrayed your own kind," he spat. "You have sided with that creature over your own race, your own class. You are a traitor to the South." "No," came Selah's voice. She had emerged from the main house and now stood on the porch, her form somehow both substantial and ethereal in the winter sunlight. "He is simply a man remembering how to be human. You should try it." Bradley's hand went to his pistol, but before he could draw it, every weapon held by the 20 armed men began to glow with pale blue light. The metal grew hot, painfully hot, and the men dropped their guns with cries of alarm and pain. The weapons fell into the snow, which hissed and steamed where they landed. "You cannot fight this with violence," Selah said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Violence is the foundation of the system you are defending. If you could have preserved your world with guns and whips and chains, you already would have. But you cannot, because the universe itself has turned against injustice. I am merely its instrument." The planters fled, their burned hands and wounded pride driving them back to their own plantations. But the story of the confrontation spread, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The woman who could make weapons burn. The man who had denounced his own kind. The plantation where slaves were free and yet remained. Spring came early to Marble Gate that year. The fields that had turned black in August began to recover, not with cotton, but with other plants, food crops that could feed people rather than enrich them. Rutledge had decided, with Margaret's full support, to transform the plantation into a farm operated by free people working for fair wages. It would not make them as rich as cotton had, but it would allow them to look at themselves in mirrors without flinching. It would give young Thomas a legacy he did not have to spend his life apologizing for. The 54 people who had chosen to stay at Marble Gate were thriving. They had built a small community within the plantation, with their own governance structures, their own schools, their own churches, where they blended Christianity with the African spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage. Old Patience had become a leader among them, her wisdom respected, her memory of Africa a treasure to the younger generations. "What will you do when she leaves?" Patience asked Rutledge one afternoon as they watched the former slaves, now free laborers, planting vegetables in fields once devoted to cotton. "I don't know," Rutledge admitted. "How will we remember what she taught us? How will we hold on to this clarity when the world around us remains unchanged?" Patience smiled, her face creased with age and wisdom. "She is not teaching you something new," the old woman said. "She is reminding you of what you always knew but chose to forget. That knowledge does not leave when she does. It becomes part of you if you let it." By summer, Selah had become translucent. When the sunlight hit her at certain angles, it passed through her as if she were made of glass. She spoke less, moved more slowly, spent long hours standing perfectly still, as if conserving some vital energy that was draining away. "She's dying," Margaret said to James one night as they prepared for bed. "No," James replied, though he was not certain. "She's returning, to wherever she came from, to whatever she truly is." The phenomena across the South had reached a crescendo. In Virginia, an entire county of plantations had been abandoned, their owners fleeing to cities, unable to face the nightly visions and daily impossibilities. In Alabama, slaves were being freed by the hundreds as owners sought to appease whatever force was systematically destroying their world. In Georgia, a group of planters had publicly converted to abolition, shocking their communities and inspiring others to question their assumptions. The political implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Northern newspapers printed accounts of the strange events with increasing urgency, using them as evidence that slavery was indeed a sin that would bring down divine wrath on the nation. Southern politicians denounced the stories as Yankee propaganda, even as their own constituents whispered fearfully about the things they had witnessed. In Charleston, Thomas Calloway, the auctioneer, appeared at Marble Gate one afternoon. He looked 20 years older than he had at Sellers' auction 9 months earlier. His hair had gone entirely white. His hands shook constantly, but his eyes held a clarity that had been absent before. "I've come to ask her forgiveness," he said to Rutledge, "for all the souls I sold, for all the families I tore apart, for the profit I made from misery." Rutledge led him to where Sailor sat by the river. Up close, Calloway could see how faded she had become, how the light passed through her. But her pale eyes were as penetrating as ever when she turned them on him. "I cannot forgive what was not done to me," Sailor said quietly. "Seek forgiveness from those you harmed, if you can find them. And if you cannot, then live differently, make different choices. That is the only absolution that matters." "Will the nightmares stop?" Calloway asked desperately. "The visions of all those I sold, will they cease?" "No," Sailor replied. "They will remain with you until you die. That is not punishment, that is memory, that is conscience. Learn to bear it with grace, and perhaps it will transform you into something better than you were." Calloway wept then, great shaking sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. When he finally composed himself and left Marble Gate, he walked differently, as if a great weight had settled onto his shoulders, but somehow made him stronger for bearing it. Others came in those final weeks. Slaves from nearby plantations who had heard stories of the bronze-skinned woman with pale eyes, free blacks who had escaped north but felt called to return and witness what was happening, even a few planters who came seeking understanding, hoping that Sailor could explain to them how to live with what they had done. To each, Sailor gave the same message in different words. The reckoning is here. The bills are coming due. How you respond to this moment will determine not just your own fate, but the fate of the nation. Choose wisely. Young Thomas spent every possible moment with her as she faded. At 9 years old, he understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary, something he would remember and speak of for the rest of his life. He asked her questions about everything, trying to absorb as much knowledge as he could before she vanished. "Will the world truly change?" he asked her one afternoon. They sat together by the river, her form so translucent now that he could see the water through her body. "Will slavery end?" "Yes," Sailor said, "but not quickly, not peacefully. The investment in injustice is too great. Too many people have built their identities, their fortunes, their entire understanding of the world on the foundation of slavery. They will fight to preserve it. And that fight will tear this nation apart." "A war?" Thomas asked, his eyes wide. "A terrible one," Sailor confirmed. "More terrible than you can imagine. It will come within a decade. It will cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But from that bloodshed will emerge a new possibility. Not justice, not yet, but the first true steps toward it." "How do you know?" Thomas whispered. Sailor smiled, a gesture that somehow conveyed both sadness and hope. "Because I am not bound by linear time as you are. I exist across moments, experiencing past and future as a single now. I have seen the war that is coming. I have seen the century of struggle that will follow it. I have seen the long, painful march toward a justice that your nation has not yet earned, but might one day achieve." "Will we survive it?" Thomas asked. "My family." "That depends on the choices you make," Sailor replied. "The path forward requires courage. It requires accepting loss. It requires standing for what is right, even when it costs everything. Your father has begun that journey. Whether he and your mother can continue it through the coming storm, I cannot say." In Charleston, the authorities had finally decided to act. A warrant was issued for Sailor's arrest on charges of witchcraft, inciting rebellion, and disturbing the peace. A detachment of 30 armed men was dispatched to Marble Gate with orders to bring her to the city for trial. They arrived on a hot August afternoon, exactly 1 year after Sellers' auction. James Rutledge met them at the gate, his rifle in hand, but before he could speak, before any confrontation could begin, the men's horses stopped moving, simply stopped, as if turned to statues, their legs frozen mid-step. "You cannot take her," came a voice. Old Patience emerged from the main house, followed by all 54 of the free labourers. They formed a line between the soldiers and the house where Seller rested. "She belongs to no one. She answers to no law but the highest one." The leader of the detachment, Captain Morris, dismounted awkwardly from his frozen horse. "This is insurrection," he said, his voice uncertain. "You are harbouring a fugitive from justice." "What justice?" Margaret Rutledge asked, stepping out onto the porch. "The justice that allows human beings to be bought and sold. The justice that tears families apart for profit. The justice that has built an entire civilization on suffering. That is not justice, Captain. That is blasphemy given the weight of law." Captain Morris looked from Margaret to the line of former slaves, to Rutledge with his rifle, to the house where Seller presumably waited. He seemed to reach some internal decision. "I will report that she could not be found," he said quietly. "I will say that she had already fled when we arrived. But know this, others will come, and they will not be so easily turned away." The soldiers left, their horses suddenly able to move again. The confrontation had ended without violence, but everyone present knew it was only a temporary reprieve. That night Seller called them all together, the entire community of Marble Gate. She stood before them in the main yard, her form now so translucent that she seemed made of moonlight rather than flesh. "My time here is ending," she said, her voice somehow strong despite her fading form. "I came to begin a change, not to complete it. That task falls to you and to millions like you across this nation. The work will be long. It will be hard. Many will die before justice is achieved, but it will be achieved because the arc of the universe bends toward justice, though it bends slowly." "Don't go," young Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. "We still need you." Seller looked at him with infinite tenderness. "You need what I represent," she said. "Hope, resistance, the belief that the world can be remade. But you do not need me specifically. Those qualities exist in each of you. I have simply reminded you of their presence." She turned to face them all, these people who had been transformed by her presence. "Remember this year," she said. "Remember what you learned. Remember that you are not alone in your hunger for justice. And when the darkness comes, and it will come, hold fast to what you know to be true. The world can change. People can change. And every act of courage, no matter how small, contributes to that change." The next morning, Selah was gone. Her cabin stood empty, the door open, nothing inside but a faint scent of rain on hot stones. The Ashley River had stopped glowing during the night, returning to its normal muddy brown. The phenomena across the south began to diminish, though they did not cease entirely. James Rutledge found a letter on his desk, written in handwriting he did not recognize, but knew must be Sellers. It contained only a few lines. "You have begun the work. Do not stop now. Teach your son well. Love your wife deeply. Treat all people with the dignity they deserve. The reckoning I began will continue with or without you. Make sure you are on the right side when it comes to its conclusion." The letter was signed not with a name, but with a symbol, an ancient mark that looked like water and wind and fire all at once. In the months that followed, life at Marble Gate settled into its new pattern. The free labourers continued their work, building a community that served as an example to others. Margaret continued teaching, expanding her school to include children from neighbouring plantations, whose owners, inspired by Marble Gate's success, had begun their own experiments with free labour. Young Thomas grew up with a moral clarity rare in his time and place. He would eventually become a teacher himself, then a lawyer, and ultimately a judge who used his position to advance the cause of justice even when it cost him personally. He never forgot the bronze-skinned woman with pale eyes who had taught him to see clearly. The phenomena that had terrified the South for a year did not disappear entirely. They diminished but remained as reminders, as echoes of Selah's presence. Occasionally, a particularly cruel slave owner would fall ill with mysterious ailments. Sometimes chains would rust through at crucial moments, allowing escape. Every so often, someone would dream of pale eyes asking, "What price are you willing to pay for what you have stolen?" Charleston itself began to change, slowly and with great resistance. A few ministers began preaching against slavery. Some businessmen started to see it as economically unsound. Young people, influenced by stories of Selah and by the clear evidence that the old order was crumbling, began to question their parents' certainties. But the change was not fast enough. The resistance to abolition remained fierce. The economic interests were too great. The psychological investment in white supremacy ran too deep. And so, as Selah had predicted, the nation moved toward war. 10 years after Selah's disappearance, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter, beginning the Civil War that would tear the nation apart. The conflict was as terrible as she had foreseen, lasting 4 years and costing over 600,000 lives. But from that bloodshed emerged the 13th Amendment, formally abolishing slavery throughout the United States. James Rutledge survived the war, though Marble Gate suffered significant damage. He spent his remaining years helping the newly freed people establish themselves, using his influence and resources to support Reconstruction efforts. He died in 1872, at peace with his conscience in a way he never could have been before Selah's arrival. Margaret Rutledge lived into her 80s, continuing to teach until her health failed. She wrote a memoir in her final years, detailing her transformation from a slave owner's wife to an advocate for racial justice. The manuscript was not published during her lifetime, but it was rediscovered in the 1920s and became an important historical document. Thomas Rutledge, true to the education Selah had given him, became one of the most important civil rights advocates of the late 19th century. He used his position as a judge to strike down discriminatory laws, to protect the rights of freed slaves, and to advance the cause of racial equality. He never spoke publicly about Selah, knowing his testimony would be dismissed as fantasy, but he thought of her often, especially in moments of difficulty, and drew strength from the memory of her unwavering commitment to justice. The people who had been enslaved at Marble Gate and were freed before the war fared better than most. They had education, experience with managing their own affairs, and land that Rutledge had legally transferred to them. They built a prosperous community that lasted for generations, serving as a beacon of what was possible when people were given genuine freedom and opportunity. Old Patience lived to see emancipation, dying at age 93 in 1866. On her deathbed, she spoke of Selah to her great-grandchildren. "She was not a person," Patience said. "She was a force. She was every prayer we ever prayed for freedom made manifest. She was the universe finally responding to the cries of the suffering. And though she came and went, what she awakened in us remains." The story of Selah spread through oral tradition in African American communities across the South. Each telling was slightly different, embroidered with local details and personal interpretations. But certain elements remained constant. The woman with bronze skin and pale eyes, the auction where she was sold for an impossible sum, the year she spent at Marble Gate transforming all who encountered her, and her disappearance as mysteriously as she had arrived. Some claimed she had never existed at all, that she was simply a legend created to give hope during the darkest years of slavery. Others insisted they had relatives who had met her, who had been healed by her, who had witnessed her miracles. Historians found scattered references in official documents The sealed auction records in Charleston, brief mentions in letters and diaries, enigmatic references in court proceedings, but nothing definitive, nothing that proved beyond doubt that she had been real. But reality and truth are not always the same thing. Zela might have been a person, or she might have been something else entirely, a collective manifestation of the longing for freedom, a spiritual force given temporary physical form, a message from a future where justice had finally been achieved, sent back to help create the conditions for its own existence. What matters is not whether Sela was real in the conventional sense, but what she represented. She embodied the idea that evil systems cannot stand forever, that conscience will eventually assert itself, that the universe itself resists injustice. She gave hope to those who had every reason to despair. She forced those who participated in slavery to see clearly what they were doing, removing the comfortable rationalizations that allowed them to sleep at night. The Ashley River, which had glowed blue for a year during Sela's presence, returned to its normal state. But occasionally, on certain nights when the moon is full, some claim to see a faint luminescence in the water, and those who drink from the river on those nights are said to dream of a bronze-skinned woman with pale eyes who asks them a single question: what price are you willing to pay for justice? The auction block at Ryan's Mart, where Sela was sold, was torn down after the Civil War. The site became a museum dedicated to remembering the horrors of the slave trade. But museum staff report strange occurrences: cold spots on hot days, the smell of rain on hot stones when no rain has fallen, the sense of being watched by eyes that hold neither judgment nor forgiveness, but simply witness. Charleston itself bears the weight of its history uneasily. The beautiful antebellum mansions remain, monuments to wealth built on suffering. The former slave markets are now tourist attractions, places where visitors can confront the reality of what happened there. And sometimes, on misty mornings, people claim to see a woman standing near the old market, her eyes pale as glass, her expression unreadable. The story of Sela became part of the larger narrative of resistance to slavery, joining the accounts of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, and countless others who fought for freedom. But while those figures achieved liberation through concrete actions, escape, education, rebellion, Sela's method was different. She achieved transformation through revelation, forcing people to see what they had been carefully avoiding. In the end, that may have been her greatest gift, not freedom itself, but the clarity necessary to recognize that freedom was both possible and necessary. She did not end slavery single-handedly. That required war, political action, the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of people. But she planted seeds that grew into the conviction that slavery must end, that it was not simply impractical or economically unsound, but fundamentally evil. Those seeds took root in unexpected places, in the conscience of slave owners who began to question their right to own human beings, in the courage of enslaved people who found new strength to resist, in the determination of abolitionists who had been fighting for decades and suddenly found their message resonating more widely, in the hearts of children like Thomas Rutledge, who grew up knowing that the old order was built on a lie. The transformation Sela began did not end with the abolition of slavery. The work of achieving genuine racial justice continues to this day, more than a century and a half after her disappearance. The systems of oppression proved resilient, adapting to new circumstances, finding new forms. Jim Crow laws replaced slavery. Mass incarceration replaced Jim Crow. Each generation must take up the work anew. But the vision Sela represented, of a world where all people are treated with dignity, where justice is not a dream but a reality, that vision endures. It lives in every protest march, every civil rights lawsuit, every act of solidarity across racial lines. It lives in the memories passed down through generations, stories told by grandparents to grandchildren about a time when the universe itself seemed to rise up against injustice. The records of Seller's auction remain sealed in Charleston's archives, available only to researchers who sign extensive agreements and promise not to reproduce certain portions. Those who have seen the documents report that the pages change depending on who reads them, that different viewers see different details, that the truth of what happened that August day in 1851 seems to resist being fixed in any single narrative. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps Seller's story is meant to be fluid, adaptable, taking the form necessary for each generation that encounters it. Perhaps she was never one thing but many things simultaneously, a person and a symbol, a historical figure and a myth, a temporary manifestation and an eternal principle. What cannot be disputed is the impact of that single year when she walked the earth. Lives were changed, minds were opened. The trajectory of history was bent, however slightly, toward justice. And in a world that often seems resistant to change, that is no small thing. The legacy of Marble Gate Plantation stands as testament to what is possible. The land is now a community farm, operated collectively by descendants of those who were once enslaved there. They grow food, teach sustainable agriculture, and maintain a small museum dedicated to telling the full story of the plantation, including the year when a mysterious woman named Seller lived there and changed everything. Visitors to the museum can see the cabin where Seller stayed, carefully preserved. They can read Margaret Rutledge's memoir. They can see Thomas Rutledge's legal papers advancing civil rights. They can walk the fields where cotton once grew and food crops now flourish. And on the final wall of the museum, they can read the words Thomas Rutledge wrote shortly before his death. She taught me that the world is not fixed, that what seems permanent can be changed, that justice is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right inherent in every human being. She taught me to see clearly, and having seen, I could not look away. That is her gift and her curse, the clarity to recognize injustice and the responsibility to fight it for the rest of your life. The story ends where it began, at the river. The Ashley River flows as it always has, carrying water to the sea, indifferent to human drama. But those who know the story of Selah cannot look at that river without remembering the year it glowed blue, the year when something extraordinary walked among ordinary people and reminded them of truths they had forgotten. They bought her body at auction, paying $15,000 for what they thought was property. But what they purchased was their own transformation. They awakened a force that could not be contained, that spread across the South and eventually across the nation. They paid for her in gold and received judgment. They sought to own her and instead were owned by the truths she forced them to confront. Selah, the woman who was promised to no man. Selah, who spoke with the voice of accumulated suffering. Selah, who embodied the reckoning that had been delayed for centuries but could no longer be postponed. She came, she transformed, she vanished. But what she set in motion continues still. On misty Charleston mornings, when the light is just right, some say you can still see her, standing near the old market, her eyes pale as fog, watching the city that sold her. She does not speak, she does not accuse, she simply stands as witness to what was and what might yet be. The most expensive slave woman ever sold in the South, the mystery they tried to erase from history, the legend that refused to die. They swore to
I'm freezing. I'm bleeding. Slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile. Every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here, maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, no, it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. No, I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay.
Some days feel off, like I'm standing but still falling. A little pain, a little tired, and no one to tell it all to.
There are days that feel unsteady, like I'm drifting out of place. Every step just feels so heavy, with a smile I have to fake. A little hurt I keep inside me, a little weight I always hide, and 1,000 quiet worries I've been holding deep inside. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I keep walking through the silence like it's all I've ever known. Every crowded room reminds me how it feels to be alone. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Maybe one day I'll be stronger, maybe I'll learn how to speak. but for now I keep it buried in the parts of me too weak. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you.